Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Great to be here, Chris. Today we are unpacking what might be the single most consequential structural deal in consumer technology in well over a decade now.
You're talking about the Apple-Google partnership, where a custom 1.2 trillion parameter Gemini model is becoming the new reasoning brain sitting inside Siri, right?
That is exactly the one. Apple is essentially admitting that after roughly 4 years of trying to build its own frontier model, it could not catch up to Google or OpenAI.
So walk me through the actual mechanics of this deal, because the joint statement from Apple and Google was carefully worded but pretty thin on real numbers and architectural details.
Bloomberg is reporting that Apple is paying around $1 billion a year for Gemini access, which is a fascinating number when you consider Apple's overall services revenue trajectory right now.
$1 billion a year sounds enormous until you remember Google currently pays Apple roughly $20 billion a year to be the default search engine in Safari, which is honestly a wild comparison.
Exactly the right comparison. So Apple is paying about 5% of what Google pays Apple in exchange for the most advanced frontier model that has ever been deployed inside consumer devices.
The really striking detail is that this is not just plain vanilla Gemini. Google built a custom 1.2 trillion parameter variant specifically for Siri and Apple Intelligence workloads at runtime.
Right, and to put that in scale, Apple's existing cloud foundation model is around 150 billion parameters. The new Gemini brain is roughly 8 times larger than what Siri currently uses.
8 times the parameter count usually means a meaningful jump in reasoning, planning, multi-step task execution, and just general world knowledge. That is really the entire point of this deal for Apple.
It is, and the leaked benchmark suggested Apple's internal foundation model, the one code-named AFM, or sometimes called LLM Siri, was lagging on reasoning, tool use, and complex multi-turn dialogue handling.
So Apple swallowed its pride here. For a company that historically insists on owning every layer of its stack, outsourcing the model layer to a direct competitor is a remarkable cultural concession indeed.
It really is, but Tim Cook has talked publicly about wanting to ship the best experience even if it means partnerships. And this fits that pattern just like the original Google search deal did.
Let's talk about how this actually rolls out for users. From what I have read, parts of this are already live in iOS 26.4. But the full conversational Siri arrives later this year.
Correct. With iOS 26.4, Siri is already using Gemini under the hood for context awareness and on-screen recognition. Things like understanding what you are looking at in any given app.
And then iOS 27, which ships alongside the iPhone 18 this fall, is when we get what Apple is calling the full conversational Siri, which is the real flagship Apple Intelligence experience.
Yes, and that is the version where Siri is supposed to feel genuinely agentic. It can plan, take multi-step actions across your apps, and handle complex requests without you having to micromanage every step.
I have to push back a little on the agentic framing, though, because Apple has been promising a much smarter Siri for honestly almost 2 years now, and the bar for credibility is pretty low at this point.
Fair pushback. Apple did pre-announce a more contextual Siri at WWDC 2024, then delayed it again, then quietly admitted internally that their own model just was not good enough.
So the Gemini deal is, in some ways, Apple buying its way out of a credibility hole it dug for itself by overselling Apple Intelligence before it was actually ready to ship at any kind of meaningful scale.
Yes, and that is precisely why the privacy story matters so much in their messaging. Apple needs users to believe that even with Google in the loop, your personal data is not flowing back to Mountain View.
So how does that actually work technically? Because if Gemini is doing the heavy reasoning, presumably some context has to leave the device for the model to do anything useful with your request at all.
The architecture splits into 3 tiers. On-device models handle anything personal, calendar, messages, photo content, health data. Private cloud compute handles medium complexity tasks on Apple's own secure servers using Apple Silicon chips.
And then for the highest complexity, frontier reasoning queries, Siri routes the request to the custom 1.2 trillion parameter Gemini model running on Google Cloud, but with very specific privacy guardrails attached.
Right, and Apple says the Gemini routing uses anonymized request tokens, no persistent user identifiers, and Google has contractually agreed not to retain, log, or train on any data flowing through that particular pipeline.
Which is essentially the same legal structure Apple used for the original ChatGPT integration with OpenAI. And to be fair, No one has publicly caught either company violating those terms in the time since signing.
True, and there is actually a really interesting wrinkle here, which is that the existing ChatGPT fallback inside Siri is not going away. Users can still opt in to route world knowledge questions over to OpenAI.
So Siri now effectively has 3 model brains it can call on. Apple's on device model, Google's custom Gemini for default reasoning, and OpenAI's GPT-5 family as an optional user-enabled fallback layer.
It is a wild architecture when you actually say it out loud. Apple has basically become a model router. The differentiation lives in the orchestration layer, the privacy guarantees, and the deep operating system integration.
Let's zoom out for a second because the strategic implications for Google here are absolutely massive. Gemini is now sitting underneath roughly 2 billion Apple devices, which is unprecedented distribution for any AI model.
That is the line everyone is circling. 2 billion devices is a moat no one else can match. Not OpenAI, not Anthropic, not Meta. Distribution at that scale changes the entire frontier model race overnight.
It also changes the unit economics. Once you have 2 billion endpoints and a custom model that is already deployed and amortized, your cost per query keeps falling while your competitive lead keeps widening over time.
And critically, it gives Google a massive training data flywheel, even with the anonymization. Aggregate query patterns, the kinds of tasks people actually ask their devices to do, that is absolute gold for model improvement.
Apple will, of course, push back hard on the suggestion that Google gains any training advantage, and the contractual language will be very clear. But the directional pressure on this stuff is real over time horizons.
100%. Even if Google is contractually blocked from training on the data, the volume and shape of the requests inform what Google should build next. Distribution is a strategy signal in and of itself.
So what does this mean for OpenAI, which until very recently was widely assumed to be the obvious partner for Apple, especially after the original ChatGPT integration that shipped with iOS 18 back in 2024?
This is a pretty significant blow. OpenAI got the showcase slot 18 months ago, and now Apple has essentially demoted them to optional fallback while Google takes the default reasoning position across the entire Siri stack today.
There's reporting that Sam Altman was personally involved in the original Apple negotiation, but that Apple grew frustrated with OpenAI's pricing. With shipping delays on the planned multimodal upgrades and with the constant boardroom drama lately.
The drama point is very real. Apple is famously risk-averse on partner stability, and OpenAI's governance situation, the various leadership exits, and the ongoing structural transition to a for-profit have not inspired much confidence.
Google, by contrast, may be the most boring possible partner from an Apple risk perspective, which in this particular context is actually a huge strategic asset for a company that values predictability and stability above all else.
Boring is the right word for it. Sundar Pichai has run Google for over a decade now. Demis Hassabis runs DeepMind, which builds Gemini and is one of the most respected researchers alive today. Stability sells.
Let's talk about the regulatory angle, because this deal cannot possibly make antitrust regulators happy. The Department of Justice is already actively litigating the Google search default arrangement with Apple as anti-competitive in federal court.
Right, and now you have Google effectively becoming the AI default across the entire Apple ecosystem on top of the search default. That is going to draw enormous scrutiny from both the DOJ and the FTC very soon.
There's a credible scenario where 18 months from now, a court orders Apple to offer users a model picker for Siri, the same way the European Union forced browser and search engine choice screens in the past.
That is very plausible, and honestly, a model picker might be good for the ecosystem overall. Imagine choosing between Gemini, Claude, GPT-5, and Llama for your Siri reasoning brain, depending entirely on your personal preferences.
From a user experience standpoint, though, most people will never touch that picker, just like most people never change their default browser. The default wins, and Google is now the default for Siri, full stop, period.
Exactly. The default is the product. That is the whole reason this deal is reportedly worth $1 billion a year and why Sundar Pichai personally flew to Cupertino to close it directly with Tim Cook.
One last thread I want to pull on. What does this do to Apple's own internal AI research effort? Because Apple has been hiring aggressively, including some very prominent poaches from Google's own DeepMind and Brain teams.
Apple insists the internal foundation model work continues and the on-device models will keep getting better over time. But realistically, the most ambitious frontier model researchers want to ship the frontier, not the third-tier fallback.
So there is a real risk of talent attrition. If you joined Apple to build the next great large language model, and your work has been demoted to the third tier of the stack, you start looking around quietly.
Several reports already suggest that exactly that conversation is happening inside Apple's AI org right now. The next 12 months are going to determine whether Apple retains its bench or watches it get poached again by hungry competitors.
All right, big picture moment. What is the one sentence takeaway you want every single listener to walk away with from this story today? Going into the rest of their week, the rest of the month, the rest of the year.
Apple just outsourced the most important software layer of the next decade to its biggest rival, and in doing so, handed Google the largest AI distribution channel in all of human history. That is really the entire headline.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.